Let's talk about John Wayne's. Last time we were very ideological. I feel like the bulk of the reading, there was so much more meat in the intro and the preface, I felt, than in that little first chapter. The first chapter was kind of like,
Yeah.
and she super quickly went over Victorian era, with this refinement and this restraint. And then in America, we had Teddy Roosevelt and we were nervous about things. And he was really strongly manly and that made people feel good. And so they're like, I want to be strongly manly. And how do we reconcile that with Christianity? And basically we just tie them together in our minds and decide that's what it is. And then we have other people go out there and just repeat it a lot, like Billy Sunday. And that gets turned into, down the line, Billy Graham. And that's where we start here. And last time I said, I didn't remember Billy Graham being that much of a linchpin. And chapter 1, he was a little bit. But man, chapter 2,
My very first note is continuation of Billy Graham being less than stellar.
the cute way of putting it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it, probably. First off, especially in that time period, there are not many people in the world who would be willing to challenge the faith of a sitting president.
Yeah.
Back then,
Oh,
that's just not something you did.
no, also though, okay, so I was looking up some stuff just because they really paint this picture of what Billy Graham looked like back in the
Right.
day. So, like, you think of like today's sneaker pastors wearing the crazy drip, going a little too hard, and he was kind of that for his day. It seems really this young, kind of cocky guy and riding the coattails. I was like, how can you think that you're that hot stuff? He asked for the meeting with the
And
president and then
more
showed
than
up.
more than
Yeah.
once.
Yeah. But that was okay, that's where I was getting into the looking things up. There was a post in 2020 when I finally found this photo of Billy Graham meeting with Truman. It was from the Billy Graham Facebook page,
Okay.
and it says the first in a long line of basically saying that he was the pastor to presidents and he was always a friend to them and this, that, and the other and blah blah had all these other photos. And like he was invited to the he was not invited. He invited himself.
Yeah,
A little bit of revisionist history on Billy Graham
right.
Facebook.
White evangelicals are really good at that, but oops, did I say the quiet part out loud?
Yes,
Yeah,
it seems
you
like
brought
it.
up his okay, first off, I just want to say I judged you a little bit when you said he had drip. I know that's what the kids are saying these days. However, it just made me feel so old
I
when
said
you
it
used
in
the word drip.
reference to
So I very quickly when you said that I one judged you and then two grabbed my book to look at how he was described and I don't think I could pull this off. A pistachio green suit, rust-colored socks, white buck shoes, and a hand-painted tie.
too much, man. It's doing too much.
That's too much back in the 50s, let alone now.
Yeah. So there were a lot of things and I mean, this happens like at the start, like before things are heating up and lots of things start shifting. But prior to this, he's wanting to go meet Truman because he's been a Democrat his life. And like, then he basically tells him he's not Christian enough and he asks him to leave. And I was losing it when they were talking about he overstayed his welcome by praying too long and then proceeded to meet the press corps in the hallway and recount the entire thing, which means somewhere we could find that. You know what I mean? That exists
Oh,
somewhere.
I didn't even think about that. You're right. That's got to be out there somewhere.
Yeah, there's an entire press corps. Not everyone got rid of it. There's no way. And so then he really is the linchpin because he starts telling Republicans that basically here's the key to my demographic and I'll give it to you if you play with me. And even like writing letters to people to run for president. Also, did you do research or do you know more about this fellowship situation?
So I have not had the time to sit down and read into that, but you better believe I like circled, underlined, like they bring up a secretive organization, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, what?
The circle and a highlight and a double.
Yeah, just a secretive group that wielded tremendous power by connecting religious, political, and business leaders to advance their mutual interests. And I'm just sitting here going, yeah, I'm not surprised that something like that exists. I don't think I've ever heard it referred to as that. So now I'm really curious and I'm absolutely going to be doing a deep dive because that's just how my brain works. I also just, there was a huge part of me through really these first couple of pages in the second chapter where I was like, we still do all this. We still have secret underhanded meetings with people behind closed doors. And you brought up the line of Graham having the key to his base. And I'm like, we still do that. Still, here we are 70 years later. And that's still a practice within our particular American voting political culture. And we cross into this recognizing that folks who are in those positions of power, folks that have that kind of influence, they want to feel like they are being listened to.
Yeah.
And so
for sure.
even just the invitation to show up, again, it's Billy Graham's the same way with his meeting with Truman, is even just being able to go and have the credibility and say, hey, I met with the president of the United States.
Yeah.
That in and of itself, and we see that, I won't name names, but there are various evangelical leaders that I still to this day see that are fairly embedded with the Republican Party and various other leaders within that political spectrum. And it's just so telling to see them talk about things, to say, here's the good that they are doing, and then to turn around and see a news article talking about the polar opposite action of whatever this person just did. And it's just, okay, so why do you ignore that? Why do you allow that to happen? But it's this idea of they still have that sense of credibility, that sense of, hey, I have influence, I have power, you look at me, I'm in the White House. And again, there's elements of that. It's okay, all well and good, but in allowing these behaviors and these thoughts and these ideas to continue and to manifest and really to fester, we've seen, and this started probably way before even Billy Graham, but we saw this manifestation of a change in evangelicals that allowed the rise of what we would know today as the religious right, and has led to you and I having this conversation, and out of a sense of anger and frustration with people who claim to believe and say one thing and then support and vote and act in a completely different way.
Basically, she starts to get into that as he's building this momentum within the Republican Party for himself and for the party with the evangelical conservative group. At this time, things start to swirl in our country, like the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and feminism. Like, these are all things that basically challenge the unquestioned authority and rights and privileges of white male patriarchy, and that's really disruptive for a lot of people. Like, again, we talked about just because something's different and is changed doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, but your brain might react that way when it first happens to literally any change because pattern recognition and comfort, and that's just the way that cognitively our minds work. But there was a hyper gripping because of all of these factors to this masculinity and the patriarchy and all this stability tied in with Christianity. And then there's also the chaos of all that throughout the country stirred things up for people regardless of where in the country they lived and just felt unstable. But then there were already people down south that were like, yes, now you all see what we're seeing. And there's like that southern kind of version of Christianity that's always hailed these more violent male types. And I went to a Christian school, like high school and all that. I was the minority in being a Nazarene, and it was mostly Southern Baptists. And as such, I sat through a lot of Southern Baptist preaching in my young life. I also learned a lot about what Nazarenes actually do and don't believe so that I could have some recess arguments with some folks who wanted to tell me why. Wrong for wearing my jeans and reading my New Living Translation.
Oh man.
I said, "But you know what? My mom knows where I was last night, so tell me
Yikes.
who's really."
Shots fired.
If you want to come to play and tell me that little rule following Lindsay is gonna burn because she actually reads her Bible because she can actually understand it, but she's wearing pants and it's not in the King's English, but you lied to your mom and snuck out of the house last night, come at me.
And that's you bring it up, and I think this is one of those things that we all recognize and we all are aware of, but there are various folks that don't want to talk about it, and it's just the level of illiteracy when it comes to scripture, it comes to theological ideas, all of these things. I literally had a conversation actually with another pastor today in which he had attended one of our Nazarene institutions. And in his very first Bible class, so this is an intro class that is gen ed, so everyone takes this. So there's 40, 45 people in the class. And the professor walks in and goes down front and introduces themselves. And very first thing that they ask, does the Bible have any errors? And he in that moment goes, well, of course not. And there's another student that actually stands up and says, no, the Bible doesn't have any errors.
What did he need to stand up?
And I don't know. But so where that story then leads, though, the professor then goes, huh, interesting. And then turns around, goes over to the computer and starts the lesson. And this pastor said that in that moment, just the interesting, and this professor walking over to the computer, his entire perception of what he knew crumbled, or what he thought he knew, as this 18-year-old punk who actually came from a Pentecostal background. Sitting in that class, he went, wait a minute, I've never even considered the thought that there might be an error in the writings or in the scriptures or the organization or whatever it might be. And he goes, even if there isn't, I've never even thought about it. And it was in that moment that he was given permission to actually sit and to begin to think. He put it
Critically.
this way. He said, I don't know anything. I realized how much I didn't know. And I realized I didn't even know the questions I should be asking until that moment in time.
Yeah. But he was willing to even just you have to be the kind of person that's willing to admit, "I don't already know everything. I can't already know everything." Because there are people that sit in those same classes, get asked that same question, and leave that classroom and say, "This school's going to hell. I'm getting taught by a heretic. This is ridiculous. This school's not even whatever anymore," and that it's real. It kind of ties in actually to what I have written down on this page where it starts to talk about the civil rights movement. If we can't admit that we didn't get everything right or we don't know everything already, we can't ever learn anything new. And in doing so, we are admitting in a way like our own omniscience. That's what you're saying. If you can't entertain and even explore the idea of a new thought or a new piece of information, you're saying there's nothing you can introduce to my mind that I haven't already known. Wow, look at you go. How did you
Right.
get there?
Yeah. Teach me your
So
ways.
teach me your ways because you fast tracked to omniscience and man, we could really use you on some things. Can you get on that cancer research thing?
World
Fix some
peace, all
stuff?
that stuff.
Like just why are you hiding? Come on. So that's the thing that the logic piece of it people don't realize because if you realize that, then you have to realize that there are things that you can't already know and you have to be open to hearing them and finding them. And so like this idea that we can't accept that we as a people got it wrong about race. Like we
Yeah.
thought, and it's easy to say, oh, people back then were dumb and bad intentioned. There were smart, well intentioned people that got it wrong. Like,
That actually, you mentioned that, and I wrote down when I had this thought, and I don't even remember which part of this chapter I was in, but I had the thought and the realization that the civil rights movement and all of that happened literally within our parents' lifetimes. It was like they were growing up in the midst of this. Many of them, depending on, again, you and I are both of the millennial generation, and depending on where others might fall within that category, there are some folks who our parents were in the midst of that and probably witnessed a lot of the elements of desegregation and just some of the hostilities towards persons of color. And I like to think that my parents are incredibly smart and incredibly intelligent. And even as I'm saying this, I've never sat down to have a conversation with them about, hey, what do you remember about the civil rights movement? But it's one of those things that this is not so far removed from our history. This is, again, it's what we're 2025 when this is currently being recorded. And that was just 60 years ago. That's not very long ago when you look at the grand scheme of the history of the world.
yeah, no, it's really not. And it's a little bit mind blowing that we got that far before we figured that out. But think that for better and for worse, the increasing pace with which information was able to be spread more rapidly, like we've been able to disseminate knowledge quicker to more parts and more brains have been able to synthesize it and say, okay, what does that mean? Let's do something with that. And I think that has sped up things. I think that was our like turning point was when we were able to finally not just have to rely on people telling someone who told someone. We could actually record things and remember things. That's when the pitch of it all started, like when it was able
Yeah.
to be producible. And it's just so interesting though that I also found it interesting that she touches on them briefly because obviously they're not the main focus of these chapters, but like this idea that there were people this entire time thinking a different thought within the church. And I had to be how old before I even knew that it was possible to think some of those thoughts and not be like wrong for it. But yeah, so the civil rights movement was really like, you're right, it's in our lifetime and we were just wrestling with it. And the other thing that really, like this whole idea of fighting for our rights to go send our kids to whatever schools and led to these creation of these Christian academies that were so they could continue segregation. Like in some ways, like I know the school that I went to was not old enough to have been seeded from that exactly, but there was this idea that we shouldn't be over there with them.
Sure.
They were gonna, and honestly, like thinking back about it, it's a fragile.
Yeah. And I'm struck by even you talking about that and describing some of that. One, a sociologist would have a field day with talking about the connection of your particular institution and how, while it might not have been around during the segregationist period, how certain things that led up to that allowed your school to still have that
Oh yeah,
mentality. And you and I both know that. And that's let's be honest, a podcast for another day. What really kind of strikes me, you're talking about the fragile self, the fragile entity, the structures, whatever it is. And I was struck by there was a moment in this particular chapter where various left-leaning individuals within the church. And again, I hesitate to even use that moniker because it means something very different even now than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago. But various left-leaning individuals within the church who spoke out against Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, all of these things, and said that in a comparison of an arms race versus a peace race, which is the consistent method of Jesus. And we saw time and time again Billy Graham advocating for violence, and if anything, nullifying and trying to delineate this Christian ethic and this idea of self-preservation and self-defense. And if we don't go do something about this now, they're going to be coming for us. And a free and strong America means that you're going to be allowed to worship God. And I'm sitting here going, one, the United States has never been the reason that I am able to worship God. Two, in the question of an arms race versus a peace race, there's a narrative within scripture that seems to stand out to me where a certain disciple stood up when an arresting group showed up to take Jesus away, lopped off a guy's ear, and Jesus stood up and said, "Put away your sword," and then healed the individual who had been hit. And if that's not a race to peace, I don't know what is.
Definitely didn't come down raining hellfire, rode in on a frickin' donkey. Like, the idea of self-defense and self-preservation, like making it okay. The Bible, even other parts of the Bible, not even just Jesus. If someone asks you for this, give them this, go this
Yeah.
extra, like that kind of stuff. Like, again, it's small because you can only think of what will happen right now. And it's you, yeah, you won right now. What might you have won? What might have come of it? Might this story have been longer and more interesting and more complex and maybe beautiful had you sacrificed something rather than dig your heels in? Yeah.
And that's the way that we have been cultivated and brought up, is this idea of an instantaneous gratification, whether that's in our religious endeavors, whether that's in our business endeavors, our personal endeavors. We want the answer right now. We want it right away. And the thought of having to wait for something to happen, to flourish, to see the fruits of our labors, we don't want that. We want something that's instantaneous. And we're not wired that way. And that's where I think so much of this is countercultural. The things that you and I have often discussed and the things that we believe, we would be considered the outliers in these ideas. And that's okay. That's just the narrative of who we are and how we have finally been able to be taught not how to think, but how to think, if that makes sense. We struggle with the big picture. We always have. And this is throughout scripture, throughout history, we struggle with the big picture. And you were talking about some of these shifts and things. We've had two massive cultural shifts in the last 500 years. You briefly mentioned one, kind of inadvertently, the printing press. Now, all of a sudden, we were able to send out information in mass, and that changed the world. And then within the last just couple of decades, the invention of this, everything, what we're doing right now, the ability to use technology to literally connect the world. And we joked when all of this was first starting, we all were like, what's it going to be like to have the totality of the information in the world in the palm of my hand? And so far, I think not only overwhelming, I think it's actually made us dumber. We have lost the ability to have these conversations. We've lost the ability to think for ourselves. We've lost the ability to go out, to look at a source, to be able to determine, is this something that is valuable, is something that makes
The
sense?
gatekeepers are gone,
Yeah.
which is both good and bad.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think we have not adapted quickly enough to the ever-changing cultural connections that we have, the 24/7 news cycle, social media, all of these platforms. And we then, as the church, which historically is slow to responding to cultural shifts, so that's just a church that's on top of things is usually 3 to 5 years behind cultural norms. And what I mean by that is methods of communication and other things like that. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of that. But we have seen these huge cultural shifts, and we have just tried to hold on for the wild ride that it has led us on. And we've not spoken out. We've not said, hey, this is wrong. We've not stood up and said, this is who we are. This is who we have been. This is who we will be. And unfortunately, it's allowed us to have a fairly distorted understanding of some things.
Tying that into that this violent mindset was fine. The quote from Pat Boone, who was at one of these like Campus Crusade or whatever rallies, and he says, "I would rather see my 4 girls shot and die as little girls who have faith in God than leave them to die some years later as godless, faithless, soulless communists."
Yeah.
And that hit me so hard because we grew up right after Columbine. Like, we were kids roughly
Yeah,
the
in
age
the
of the
midst of it.
kids when Columbine happened, and there was this big thing of, would you like, basically, little kids being told, "Would you be Christian enough to let someone shoot you?" What? I'm 5, man. Or I don't even know exactly what age I was, but I was young. Some of that gets me on some of this too because he was talking, but maybe his kids were there. Like, his kids might have been at the show. They might have heard that. And it's just this, like, that's not a thing that a little tiny kid brain should have to grapple with
Yeah.
because I don't fully know what I am or my existence yet. I don't have the capacity to grasp these things. I should not have to be worried about my life and my death. And that just, like, when I read that sentence, I just wrote in the margin Columbine
Yeah.
because I just remember that so vividly, that, like, kind of language being used. And, like, this whole thing about and in the meantime, like, they really don't like Kennedy because he's too Catholic. That killed me. I was like, "Okay." And then he's not extreme enough that
Yeah, especially once they realize that there is a benefit to themselves or the outcome can be favorable. That's one thing that I've had the funny conversation with folks, even just in the last couple of years of, so especially when they find out I'm a pastor, there's the odd side eye and they look and they go, "You're not like in a cult." And it's just, and I have to laugh, but it's because when you think about it and when you look at the situation, you hear all of these conversations and all of that. Yeah, it's a huge group of people getting together. Many of them do not want to think for themselves. Many of them just want to be able to coast through all of this, be given the things that they are given. But, and again, the things that we are seeing promised over and over again in these first couple of chapters, they want that stability, they want that consistency. And it's something that is, unfortunately, I think the church is worse off because of it, because we do so often discredit those people. We do so often encourage them to not think in those ways. And yet, the minute that someone does push back against something, they're labeled as a heretic or a troublemaker or some young, foolish person who just doesn't know better yet.
or a feminist
Yeah,
somebody.
I've been called worse. Not by you, maybe by you. I don't know.
No.
Well, one thing that really stood out to me, I had a big old star next to this, and I'm not surprised, but just how different these opposing views have gotten. It's wild to see how these opposing groups are seeing politics as an expansion and an expression of their faith, and yet they are so diametrically opposed to one another. These are people who have been given the same resources, the same starting point, and through nature and nurture and all kinds of other things that are way beyond my realm of profession, they have arrived polar opposite ends of the
Yeah.
spectrum in some of these conversations.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that, like, I look at and I just go, we've lost the plot.
Yeah.
If we cannot fundamentally agree and say that the people of the world and the people of our country and the people of my neighborhood deserve better, then I don't know, what are we even doing anymore? If we
Yeah.
can't go out and say, use these resources so that my neighbor has a better education and a better safety experience and is able to walk down the street without fear of being shot or pulled over because of their skin color. If we can't do those things, then we have completely missed the boat as to what it means to be a believer of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have to throw my arms up in the air and just say, what are we doing?
Yeah. No, I think I just keep coming back to, I don't know how to tell you that you should care about other people. It's because if you don't know, you don't know, and I don't know how to make because you should know. Exposing yourself to more people and more stories and more things that aren't like you or are different or might challenge you is so important. And being open to say, what is this teaching me that I didn't already know? What does this change about my perspective? We have to care and we have to be willing to see the story of our neighbor to know that it needs help.
And we want these things to be very easy. We want these
Mhm.
things to be very black and white. And this is, I think, tying into towards the end of this particular chapter. Holy cow, John Wayne was a scumbag. Just his overt racism and some other issues and things like that. But the reason I bring him up is because some of the work that he did as an actor, his particular movies and works, there was a very clear good guy and a very clear
Mhm.
bad guy. And it made it very easy to understand, in this instance, John Wayne is the good guy and whoever it is that he's going up against is the bad guy. And
Mhm.
we as Christians latch onto that because it's easy to identify. It's easy to say, this is what I am, this is what I am for, this is what I am against. And the problem is, and the author even talks about this a little bit, starts to get into it. Let's be honest, the real world isn't that way. Very rarely do we ever have a black and white issue when it comes to trying to identify these things.
Yeah.
And you bringing up the unwillingness to learn, the unwillingness to just, again, even ask the right questions and to see how is it that our neighbor is doing. I'm sitting here reflecting on the fact that the denomination that I'm affiliated with is in 160 plus world areas all over the globe. And I say world areas because there are places that we would get in trouble if the governments found out we were there. And I'm sitting here, you talk about privilege. I'm a white heterosexual male, evangelical. I understand privilege. I understand that I have been a receiver of privilege. And as you said, I hope now I am able to use my privilege for good, if I can put it that way. But if I would be foolish enough to sit here and think that the Christians that are in these 163 other world areas don't have something to teach me, then I would be a fool. And especially the ones that are in places that are actually experiencing persecution and hardships, and they're not sure where their next meal is going to come
Mhm.
from. And yet they are still faithful and they are still trying to care for their neighbor. And that's just where I think that maybe is the one time that the situation is black and white, that I've got it way easier than they do. And yet their faithfulness is just off the charts.
Mhm.
And I can learn from that. I think we all can.
Yeah. I think that the whole self-preservation, self-defense thing is something that we talked about earlier. We like to use as justification for there's no clause in the Bible that says if you're really scared though, it's okay to do this first. Like if you're really worried and you really don't think anything like that's not countercultural. That's just what everyone else would do already. That's
Yeah.
not that weird. It's not that special. And this just like the dichotomous thinking it traps people in systems, but it also traps people in, like, emotional ideologies of who they can and can't be. He gets into the part even when she's talking about the failure to win at Vietnam was, like, America's failure as a manly country.
Yeah.
Just comical to think about. So that was, like, something that everyone felt like they had to go out and prove, and, like, this whole book of, like, how to make a man out of a boy and, like, these really
Yeah.
hard lines of what you do and don't do if you're, like, the proper I again, like, in some ways, it's so interesting, like, there were subtle little ways that I don't know if my parents even realized that they were, like, coloring outside the lines, but they did like, they just my mom was I just think was like, "It's not a big deal, who cares?" About certain things, like, just was able to see through the BS on some stuff and not fuss with it with everything, but, like,
You mean
I wrote
I'm not going to go to hell if I'm using playing cards with faces?
oh my gosh, no. That was my grandma, not my mom,
Oh, sorry.
but that was Eileen, not Diane.
For them, it was more mixed bathing, which is swimming, by the way.
My mom
Uh,
never cared about that stuff.
oh man.
It was at
Sure.
camp and you just had to follow them, which was
Yeah.
ridiculous, but, like, when I had
Yeah.
friends over, we all just wore what normal children wore. Like, I
Yeah.
wasn't allowed to wear a bikini, but I was allowed to wear a normal two-piece tank top
Sure.
swimsuit, and it wasn't like,
Yeah.
"You gotta wear a whole, like, t-shirt because you might raise
Scandalous.
your arm." Ridiculous, but my parents didn't care about those kinds of things, and I honestly think some of it came out of the pragmatism of being from a farm area. I think there's a little bit of, "Let's not be fussy. Let's just chill out a little bit, like, we've got business to take care of." And that kind of trickling in over generations, I think, in some ways. But the thing that made me think of this, like, coloring outside the lines was this whole idea of how to make a man out of a boy and all these rules about what everyone could do and how they could be. The ripple effects of that just, like, on our society, like, can be seen even before this book happened, like, with Billy
Yeah.
Graham feeling like he had to prove himself and be all these things, and he did all this stuff and spiraled into all of this, but this idea of playing with boys' toys and that kind of thing. So, our pastor at the time was older. He was, like, very bookish, very studied, he had his doctorate and all those kinds of things. He was just, like, a different kinda dude, and he drove a Volkswagen Beetle, and my brother thought that car was the coolest. He thought pastor's car was the coolest. He was probably 5, maybe, but he thought it was the coolest. He had to be, yeah, 4 or 5, because in the year 2000, Barbie, Mattel,
Oh,
released
yeah.
a Volkswagen Bug that was
I
blue,
remember that.
and Ryan got one for Christmas.
Good for him.
And he was so excited. I don't know if they knew, like, truly how outside the lines that was. I don't think
Yeah.
they did. But, like, stuff like that, just, like, in my kid brain made doing things a little different, like, I think more okay than I even realized at the time. And just yeah, I don't know. I just
I
felt like it
think
was worth
in
talking about Ryan's Barbie car.
Yeah, no, and in contrast to that, I think of a story my dad told me several years ago of him growing up just a little too young for the draft. Growing up as a kid, there was a neighbor of his just down the street who had been drafted. But they had some conversations, sometimes as you do as neighbors. One day, my dad hears that his neighbor's coming home, and he goes, "Oh, okay." His neighbor's coming home. A couple days later, he shows up. And my dad happens to see him, and he is missing a limb. As I was reading through this, I thought of this story. I can guarantee you that particular individual doesn't give a rip about what kind of toys your brother plays with. When we talk about trying to turn the country a masculine direction, again, we've already had all kinds of issues with sending our young men and our boys really into a war zone like that. Of all of the things that we could care about, it's not the individual showing up at home missing an arm or a leg that is going to be throwing a fit about whether or
Yeah.
not someone is playing with a Barbie doll.
Right.
And I'm just,
And we don't give those men the capacity or the opportunity to develop the emotional skills to communicate or process what they deal with and see over there because they lived in a world that didn't give them the skills to survive that in a normal day,
I,
like normal life stressors, let alone the trauma and the tragedy that they go over there with. I don't know how to talk about my bad day on a normal day, let alone the horrors I've
right.
lived through because we've put them in a box that says you're not allowed to talk about it. And so they've never seen it modeled. They don't know how to do
Yeah.
it, and no one's teaching them and no one's asking them. And it's just, I think what people hear when we talk about gender boxes and things is if you are of a more traditional upbringing, which most of our country is, if we're going to be honest, it's this desire of evil or greedy feminists to unseat good intentioned white men from their rightful places in power, but it's not that there's an issue with only certain kinds of people being in the seats of power. It's that those seats of power and those structures that uphold putting them there put you in cages as well, like why the suicide rate is higher with men. Like, we teach them violence is okay, they're more likely to actually execute on it. Two, they have less connection to each other, and because they don't know how to talk to each other a lot of the time, like,
Right.
unless they willfully learn it.
Yeah. They've never seen it mirrored by
No,
somebody.
no, and then they're also like, "But who would I talk to even? Because Joe doesn't think we should be talking," like, and
Right.
so there's that, and then there's, like, just the inability to even internally process it themselves because they've not been taught or taken the time to learn those things, and so I think the, like, part that gets lost a lot on gender discussion and the importance of it that people don't finish the thread with is, okay, so there's oppression and there's, like, violence against women, but violence by who?
Yeah.
Why aren't we going to what's causing these? Because it's
Yeah.
most often men, and that's the joke on the internet is, "Who would protect women if there were suddenly no men?" And the joke is, "Protect us from who?"
Yeah.
And the issue is that we don't talk about, let's teach little boys how to take care of themselves and each other and like emote and converse and process feelings and all these kind let's raise healthier little boys and then we won't have to keep having the same conversation instead of vilifying everyone and just ending it there. Like that's I think the part that makes me crazy because it feels like just you're just saying what's wrong, you're never trying to fix it.
That's the takeaway I think from this conversation that I would want people to go out and to do is to obviously you and I are having this conversation. We're talking about these things. Who knows the directions that we go with some of these sometimes. The reason that we are doing this is we want to see the people in our lives, the people that we learned from, the people that will be in our lives in the future to be better and to be able to do these things that we are talking about. And so yeah, that takeaway of just it's gonna be so cliche. I apologize in advance. Be the change you wish to see in the
Oh
world. I
no.
know,
Oh
I
Mark.
know. But like as cliche as
I
that
get you.
is, yeah,
No, but if
it's
you want something to be better, you have to be better.
yeah, and
That's
that's
why we can't be hateful back at hateful people.
you talk about for people who just don't have the tools or the skill sets to do these things, go and do those things. Be the source of learning for those people in your life.
Keep learning. keep being kind, and I don't know, what's the third thing? I
I,
feel like
I
those are
I've
pretty good, pretty good. Keep learning and keep being
yeah,
kind.
I've already said one cliche thing today. I probably
Okay.
shouldn't say another.
Oh, that sounds good. Alright. Goodbye, guys.